Good afternoon. I think we should get started again so that we can finish on time. If you would please take your seats. My name is Petra Kaufmann. I work for the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at the NIH. And it's my privilege to moderate this last session of the day entitled Getting Unstuck, Aligning Incentives. So this is about what some of the obstacles are, what the bottlenecks are that keep us where we are right now, and also what prevents us from going where we want to go. And we have a great panel of speakers today and discussants. I refer you to the speaker biographies that you all have, I assume, and I also hope that you can hold any questions other than immediately clarifying questions for the end of the speakers' presentations, so that we can have that as part of the panel. So it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, John Doyle, who is a Senior Vice President and Managing Director at QuintilesIMS, and who will talk about contract research organizations' perspective. John?
Good afternoon, everyone. So I have some variety in my professional life. I split my time between QuintilesIMS and also teach at Columbia University, class in pharmacoepidemiology. And I have to say, my clients are not as tough as my students. The students nowadays all jam away on their laptops and they fact check every citation you make and they reanalyze and graph and come see you afterwards. So hopefully you're more like my clients than my students. So from the CRO perspective, we see this transformation in healthcare as an exciting mountain climb, so to speak. And the nature and the theme of this discussion is about getting unstuck. And I do feel we're on our way, although we might only be at base camp. But a lot of the trends that we all see and we've talked about today in terms of the growing costs and the shrinking reimbursement, new market entrants like biosimilars, the ability and the need to go from a macro population view to a micro patient view is all drawing more demand on real-world data. And the hope is that we get better and better at improving patients' lives. And we want to do this in terms of their outcomes, in terms of their quality of care along the way, and hopefully we could save money as we're doing it. So there are three terms that we use in our world in the contract research organization. And it begins with really the definitions we talked about today, so I won't repeat. But essentially, we do bifurcate real-world data from real-world evidence with the application of scientific methodology. The first box is really about using real-world data in our world to deliver trials better, to essentially improve process and efficiency of trials. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. We also want to design better studies, though, and we want to test innovative methodologies, blending prospective and retrospective treatment approaches. Finally, we want to build this in a scalable, systematic way. How do we industrialize real-world evidence? The earlier discussion was fascinating in terms of how to potentially franchise it. We're not there yet, but we are along the way of building platforms to actually facilitate real-world evidence generation. And I'll conclude my talk on that topic. So the world we live in is becoming more complicated. And I think we can all kind of now agree that we're moving from volume to value. Next up, hopefully, is outcomes. And we see some outcomes-based contracts and some other means of interaction between these interdependent stakeholders in the healthcare system. And a lot of my work today in real-world research has to do with the connections, the interconnectivity, if you will, between the stakeholders and conducting studies that better meet the needs of these various stakeholders, but it's becoming quite convoluted in doing so. So one simple analogy I like to draw is to the Rubiks Cube. So in the old world, we used to generate evidence in a very systematic, methodical way. As most of us being scientists in the room, we probably kind of have an affinity toward the left-hand panel of the screen, where it's structured, organized, nice and neat. But the reality of the situation is we live in an emerging world that's much more complicated. And instead of generating evidence that meets the needs of a policymaker or a regulator or a payer or a patient in a very structured, siloed way where we could solve for each one of those individually, we need to solve for all of them in a very bespoke fashion. And that becomes very complicated. How do we actually blend the needs, the requirements of these various stakeholders when we're starting up a new study? Well, a few things that we're trying to do better in terms of aligning these stakeholders in the marketplace. One is to move away from this model of making a lot of assumptions when designing a study, and hopefully doing it in a much more fact-driven way, an evidence-based manner. Another way is, instead of being variable and reactive to what's happening along a trial, and then going in and doing some monitoring, for instance, and deciphering where there might be some risk to the quality of the data set, or trying to address bias and confounding in a way that's reactive, we want to be much more predictable and proactive in doing so. I already mentioned the approach of being more integrated and being thoughtful about the knock-on effect. If you're solving something for a regulator that really is focused on efficacy and safety, what are we missing in terms of a patient perspective on real-world benefit and risk? And then finally, instead of practicing the art of risk avoidance, let's begin to embrace and share risk along the way. So here are some ways we're doing this. In clinical trial operations, if I kind of continue with this theme of mountains, you've got some peaks. And this is just illustrative, so any of the student types out there that are going to analyze the height of each peak and then come back and cross-examine me, it's not going to happen. But essentially, these are the peaks that give clinical ops folks fits. And they want to begin to address these pain points, if you will, in a more data-driven way. Historically, we've done this with a lot of assumptions and know-how and some expertise in terms of trial design. And of course, bring in clinical opinion, epidemiologic opinion, patient opinion, et cetera. But if we're doing this in an anecdotal way, in a non-systematic, data-driven way, then we're not going to optimize the process. So we're just beginning to address some issues like predictable timelines, networking investigators, alleviating some of the patient burden, trying to do a better job of applying real-world data to answer some questions that can't be answered in the clinical trial setting, and then addressing some of the shifting regulation. So to be more specific, we're using real-world data to validate protocol feasibility and advisability, trying to actually simulate, based on secondary data sources, how this trial will unfold based on our analysis of historical clinical trial data, which we've been collecting for decades, and secondary sources like electronic health records and claims data, et cetera. Can we find alternative pathways to recruitment, to linking patients to sites? Can we empower CRAs with actual better data to share with their sites to identify patients? Can we improve the efficiency and the quality of data collection? Risk-based monitoring, of course, is taking off across the board with many CROs and sites. And we're building a lot of infrastructure and dashboards to better understand and predict where the next problem is going to be. I like to use the analogy of Minority Report, if you remember that movie for a number of years ago. We're not quite at the point where the marble drops and we come busting into the investigator sites and trying to change things, but we are getting better at predicting what's going to happen next in a particular trial based on real-world data patterns. We're using some techniques like machine learning, but a lot of it has to do with just very specific analytics based on epidemiologic real-world evaluation of treatment process and outcome and risk factors. We're getting a little better at automating workflow in a way that, again, is using real-world data to improve submission timelines. So we're making progress. The integrated process of using clinical data to automate these workflows, together with sharing that information with sponsors and investigators and regulators, is reducing recruitment timeline. This is just anecdotal, but some evidence points to about a third reduction in recruitment timeline based on data-driven methodology. Another thing that we're doing, based on evaluation of electronic health records and claims data, is doing a better job of connecting referral sites so that we do hopefully a more efficient play at actually getting patients to find the right investigators in a trial and to connect investigators. And that also has increased recruitment rates by about 50% historically. And then last but not least, we are using techniques like risk-based monitoring I mentioned before, and that's resulted in a 25% reduction in cost in some cases in terms of clinical trials. I just saw a publication this morning that has risk-based monitoring at alleviating almost a third of costs because of the site-related costs of traditional monitoring. So I think there's some room there for continued progress and improvement. So moving now forward beyond real-world data, that's kind of the first phase of how we're applying this science. It's real-world evidence generation and thinking through, what is the pull on creating new evidence? Most of these we've discussed a bit, so I'll just share top line. One has to do with the fact, very simple fact, I think we finally have consensus on, is that real-world patients are fundamentally different than clinical trial patients. I think that's been a well-known industry fact for years, decades, but no one really wanted to acknowledge that fact, and now we appreciate the fact that it is, and that if we're going to understand real-world performance of products that prove their performance in an experimental setting with a very select patient type, then we need to connect the dots. We need to bridge that gap with real-world evidence. So a lot of our research now is focused on extending what we found in the clinical trial setting with more diverse patient populations, longer-term follow-up, lack of perfect adherence, et cetera. We know also that patients and payers, of course, are increasingly demand proof of value. Just prove it. That's their motto, and they want to see comparisons to standard of care. We're missing that in many cases in clinical trial settings for very good reason, for ethical reasons and practical reasons, but then again, it's incomplete, so we need to augment. Then finally, because of precision therapy, there's a number of subpopulations out there where we just don't have the answers. I think we always appreciated we didn't have the answers for the very low probability adverse events, but there are a lot of other answers we need to continue to ponder on the benefit side as well. It needs to be a full equation of benefit and risk and looking at subpopulations of interest. So, it's exciting to see. I really like the presentation on NEST and what was going on with the medical devices. If you kind of dig into some of the guidance documentation in medical devices, it's exhilarating, right? You see there's room for hypothesis generation. There's room for historical control arms. There's room for reclassification, label expansion, ongoing public health surveillance, post-approval and post-marketing studies. This is really a good leading indicator of where a lot of the drug research can go and is going. So what I thought I would do now is just talk a little bit about some different methodologies. Some call it mosaic methodology, where you're blending some traditional RCT themes and some unconventional RWE themes. So we break them down into 4 different categories. One is extension, essentially taking a more traditional RCT that's going to become a rollover potentially. And when consenting patients at that phase, we also consent them to link their data to EHR, claims data, even their Fitbits. So we're doing some research now that uses that type of social media data, et cetera, to get a more holistic view of these patients and then link it back to the clinical trial data that was collected. So have really an amalgamation, if you will, of RCT data and observational data. Another technique is augmentation, which I just touched on. You've probably been watching some of the FDA approvals where a historical arm in Merkel cell carcinoma was recently used, essentially taking the primary data from the agent in a single R open trial and then augmenting it with secondary data for historical control, simulating a control based on secondary data. That's quite interesting, especially in rare disease. Enrichment is a phrase we use to actually do something similar, but do it for the agent of interest and the comparator. So we take a prospective design, could be an RCT, could also be a registry. In many cases, we see that these registries are becoming platforms where we kind of bolt on additional data sets from secondary sources to get a more complete view, all through the consent of the patient. And then we spoke, I think, at length in the morning session on pragmatic randomization. One thing about the pragmatic design, because in some cases it does look like it's the panacea, you get the best of both worlds. You begin to address the chance, the bias, the confounding, the threats to validity through randomization, but then again, you have this observational follow-up period, so you represent, hopefully, a generalizable way of thinking. And when you look at some of the randomized pragmatic trial elements to be considered, the one I just wanted to focus on for a minute, it has to do with what they call primary outcome, or how relevant is the outcome to the participants. And I just wanted to tell a very quick anecdote, which relates to my final slide coming up. So we're building an evidence platform in lung cancer right now, which I'm going to speak to in a minute. And essentially, we designed this with a lot of expertise. Oncologists, epidemiologists, thought leaders, patient advocates who are representing patient societies, all came together with the sponsor, with the research team that I was representing, and we actually went through and designed about a dozen protocols that we're going to use to interrogate a multi-year platform for lung cancer patients across Europe. And essentially what we did then was we said, let's hit the pause button on design and go pressure test this design with hundreds of patients and physicians in the community, payers too. So essentially, let's crowdsource what we just did as experts, and let's just see what we find. And what we found was, it was almost like a normal distribution. We agreed on a lot of it in terms of what we should go after in terms of outcomes and process metrics and cost and quality of life. And then we didn't agree on some that the crowdsourcing technique said to us, you're way off base. We don't care about some of these outcomes. They don't matter to us. And then there was a bunch where they said, you missed the boat. Here's a few that are important to us as community stakeholders that you're missing with your design. And it was eye-opening going through that exercise and realizing that we had not figured it all out through an expert channel. There was a lot more to be done in this design. And essentially, the concept, though, behind the platform was to try to generate evidence in a reliable fashion that could be sustained over years. So instead of having a one-hit wonder registry and designing it once and just hoping that in 3, 5, 10 years it was still going to be relevant, which it could be, we thought, what if we did it in a way that could perpetuate and have a learning system behind it? So essentially, go across Europe, we have about 8 different countries involved, and disparate connections across these data sets. We can't integrate it all. It's impossible. Most of you out there will say, we know that, because in Europe, you're not going to be able to do that. You have to go behind the firewall and essentially assemble your protocols and have them run behind the firewall. But essentially, we can amalgamate them in a way that we could parallel process on a common data core, if you will, so that we could ask a research question about lung cancer patients that heretofore any one country, any one academic center wasn't able to answer on their own. And only when they saw that, they began to realize and appreciate the upside of banding together to try to solve best outcomes, best care, and lowest cost for lung cancer. So I'll pause there, and I think we probably are holding until the Q&A after. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you.